Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's book show. As always, we start by looking at the bestseller lists on Amazon.co.uk and the Sunday Times, the oldest and most influential book sales chart in the UK. Then we'll be chatting to Tess M Calloway, who has worked in the cosmetics industry for nearly 40 years as a skin scientist and claims consultant. She's a biochemist and graduate of the University of Bath. The Zoe Blaze Mysteries is a thrilling crime series that takes you behind the scenes of the cosmetics industry, a hyper-competitive world that hides hard science behind pretty packaging. Book 1 in the series is called Pink Bobbit. Joining us on the line now is Tess M Calloway, who's worked in the cosmetics industry for nearly 40 years as a skin scientist and claims consultant. She's a biochemist and graduate of the University of Bath. She's with us on the book show to talk about the Zoe Blaze Mysteries. It's a thrilling crime series that takes you behind the scenes of the cosmetics industry, a hyper-competitive world that hides hard science behind pretty packaging, and written by a leading expert who knows where the bodies are buried. Welcome to the book show, Tess.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm very pleased to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. And how exciting. How long have you been working on this series?
I've been working on this series since 2019. That's when I started, so it's quite a while ago. It was meant to be one book, just Pink Bobbit, but as I suppose once you start writing, you suddenly realise, there's a sequel coming up. So what I did, I wrote the 3 and had them all ready by early 2025. And then I spent the time to polish them up and I launched them late last year. So it's been a roller coaster of a ride, definitely.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about your background then and what you've done over the years in the cosmetics industry.
Okay. So my background, yes, I've spent nearly 40 years in personal care, particularly skin research, and that's corporate skin research. And so I entered the cosmetic industry it just happened in a way. I was actually in academia working at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and I was invited by LVMH Dior to help them on what was their Capture project. Capture is still a brand that they own, and that's how I entered the cosmetics industry. But I've always been in the scientific category. I haven't worked in marketing, though a lot of my work straddles that. So I've been fortunate to have worked all over the world. And I've been now here in Germany nearly 20 years. And certainly for most of that part, I've been running my own consultancy in troubleshooting cosmetic claims for both brands and ingredient suppliers. And it is really a thrilling roller coaster. And I write a great deal, shall we say, in my real life. So this is non-fictional work. So I've written books on developing cosmetic claims. And I also publish widely within both peer review as well as trade journals. And I enjoy mentoring customers and also new people into the industry, particularly those who've created indie brands. But I'm always left with those sort of what-if questions, right? And so I took these what-if questions and decided, okay, why don't I take this fictional narrative freedom and see how far this could take me into writing thriller fiction.
Yeah.
And I've also been able to use the stories to, if you like, mirror my non-fictional work, because it does allow me to ask those should we say, those dark questions. It allows me to go behind, shall we say, the regulatory limits that are imposed of us by law, and, shall we say, investigate the dark side.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing. So in terms of cosmetic claims and things that you're dealing with at work, then what kind of claims are people making? You must get a real insight into the business and see brands in a very different light.
Oh, yes. They always want to make claims that sort of push the boundaries of the law and don't understand that. And here in the European Union, and I'll include the UK in this as well, is that the legislation, it's good. It's a tight regulation and it's enforced, which is great for mainstream cosmetics, but that doesn't stop brands wanting to, shall we say, push the fence over and start making claims like the clean beauty claims. I mean, what does clean beauty really mean? There's no legal definition. And then sometimes with the anti-aging claims, they want to delve deeper into the skin and talk about things that can only be spoken about in medical terms. And so this sort of crossing that borderline that between medicines and cosmetics. So I get this a lot. But I think the biggest difficulty brands have is how they translate data that they've generated when they've tested their products into that sort of comfort language that the law only allows us to use. So while we are allowed, when we're talking business to business, we can use very medical, scientific research terms, but you would never be allowed to use those when you are talking business to consumer. And so there's a lot of conflict there. And I do feel for brands, but at the end of the day, our duty is to care for the consumer. You know, we generate products to care for their skin, their hair, their nails, and their teeth, you know, their toothpastes and sun care. And that duty of care has to take priority over marketing tantrums at the end of the day.
So is it consumers who come to you or brands?
It's brands, it's ingredient suppliers, it's also the press, because I write a lot certainly for the trade magazines. I don't deal with the consumer. No, my work is business to business. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Because, there's a lot of discrepancy when it comes to how some brands advertise themselves. You said clean, but also using words like green or organic or plant-based or vegan or this kind of thing. We see these words and assume that it's a fantastic product, but it can just have one ingredient in it that's organic and the rest can be crap. Quite frankly.
Yes. And this is where the issues with compliance come in, because when you generate a claim, the law demands that you have to fulfill 6 criteria in order to make that claim compliant. And so just having, as you said, one ingredient that's organic doesn't make your product organic.
No.
I tell you what got out of hand was greenwashing. I mean, greenwashing affects every industry, whether you're selling cars, lawnmowers, or lipsticks, you know. And the law in just about everywhere has really come down hard on that, and the cosmetic industry is not immune to it. And so there is, yes, a lot of care and attention. The brands have a lot of have the responsibility at the end of the day to make sure that their claims they make stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
And the consumers really keep them on their toes. But of course, we run up against a lot of misinformation, and social media is just full of it. And it's, misinformation is driven by everyone, not just the consumer. The industry can do it. The regulatory people can do it, the press. and it just needs to stop. And I believe if the industry slowed down, and I mean really slowed down, and not try to keep pushing out new products every 5 minutes, because the customer, I don't believe, wants new products every 5 minutes. They just want products that they can believe in and do what they want them to do.
Yeah.
But I believe if the industry slowed down, we could really take on misinformation and stop it. But there's lots of good work in that area, particularly with all those teams working on Sense About Science and things like this. So
interesting.
I'm optimistic for the future.
Oh, good. That's good. So let's talk about the books. Tell us about your protagonist, Zoe Blaze.
Okay, so I created Zoe Blaze. She just popped into my head one day, and I really love her. She's not a scientist like me. She's actually a financial fraud investigator. And she works for this rather shady consultancy company investigating financial fraud in the pharmaceuticals and the cosmetic industry. So although she's not a scientist or even a formulator, she's skilled in tracking incentives, patterns, and money rather than molecules. And so she views systems like outsiders do with critical skepticism. And she's able to spot those common warning signs, the secrecy, the conflicting incentives, and corporate strategies that view risk as just collateral damage. And so in Pink Bobbit, which opens the series, and certainly it opens this enormous Pandora's box, or great big can of worms, if you like. It opens with this rather grotesque series of murders, and her colleague is one of the victims. So what initially appears sensational gradually reveals, shall we say, this internal logic that's rooted in ambition and exploitation, where a cartel are driving that. And because the novels are set against the backdrop of a fictional collapsed beauty industry, this cartel has arisen like some Medusa out of the ethers. And so as Zoe and her team dig deeper, should we say, conventional crime scenes aren't there. She's got laboratories, supply chains, exclusive nightclubs and boardrooms. And so it's these rather than your traditional crime scene that expose how beauty becomes both weapon and motive. And then when I move into Cold Indifference, which is set 3 years later, I widen the scope and the geography so that it becomes darker and very cold and very indifferent, like the title. And so we shift from individual crimes that we saw in the first book to systemic behaviour. And that makes it more frightening because the novel explores how clinical data, consumer psychology, and corporate insulation can enable harm at a vast scale. But it's not through brute force, with thugs and guns like some thrillers. It's very subtle, it's very cold, it's very sharp. So we're looking at addictive dependency and seduction to drive that. And of course, it causes some terrible events in this book because with the book, I took some of the aspects that eventually came out in COVID about when consumers were unable to go to the hairdressers, the salons and the like, and what that impact had on their health. And then I took that and I twisted it and tied it in with the skin's microbiome. Of course, hopefully listeners will understand the microbiome from eating, yogurts and having a good diet and stuff. And I twisted the twist, if you like, and it does make for a very scary novel. And of course, then there's also betrayal in there and treachery. And I've even surprised myself that Zoe actually made it to the end of the book, because then when we come into Digital Facade, which takes place 6 months later, I push that darkness and that terror, if you like, even further, because what's happening in the book could really happen in real life, and actually frighten myself, because I've introduced AI, behavioural modelling, and tech-driven beauty platforms. And so we have this case where this rather arrogant, insufferable Silicon Valley billionaire who's only just in his 30s, who, like an idiot, he makes a devil's bargain with the leader of this cartel to promise personalization. But what's at stake is influence and total dominance over people, because you have the ability to shape perception and desire and self-worth algorithmically. And in doing that, the conspiracy theories just think, oh my goodness me, you could actually use a beauty app to dominate the world. It's not quite as bad as that. But whilst it is totally exaggerated, the real science underpinning the story is already here. These developments are already underway. We hear it in the news all the time, and we're seeing this backlash against AI. And so anyone reading Digital Facade will probably want to delete all their beauty apps and get rid of the digital mirrors. And so, yes, am I writing at the edge of reality? Of course I am, but I don't create impossible science. This is not Star Trek. What I do is I base everything on current technologies and industry standards. And the thriller tension stems from how near I can bring this fiction to the reality that I actually work in my day job. And that's where the most gripping stories emerge. So Zoe Blaze, the mysteries exist between proof, persuasion, data, desire, and vanity. And they capture the contradictions that I've observed over decades. Yeah. So we're talking about brilliance, hubris, innovation, impatience, ethics, and of course, ambition. And so at its core, the series isn't just about cosmetics, it's about systems and what happens when the stories we create to market cosmetic products start to influence consumer behavior rather than serve the consumer. And so the question that keeps guiding me is what occurs when the science of beauty ceases to protect consumers but begins to control them. And so that's where these books came from. I know it sounds a bit complicated, but
no, it's fascinating.
The readings on my website will help readers understand. Yes. So
okay. And what's your website?
It's tessmcalloway.com.
Okay. Perfect. Well, there's 3 in the series, as you mentioned: Pink Bobbit, Cold Indifference, and Digital Facade. Pink Bobbit is the first one, so that's the one we'll put up on our website so listeners can get a copy from there. And it's great to chat with you, Tess Calloway. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much indeed. It's great to have been here.
This is Talk Radio Europe.
Online at tre.radio.
TRE.